as you can see, furze is no longer the bush of flaming gold it was a month or two ago. However, several other members of its pea family are now in flower, and they all have the same basic floral structure as furze. And it might be a good idea, if you want to refresh your memory of what the structure of the flower in the pea family is, to revisit that episode where we talked about furze. But because the flowers are smaller, sometimes they're much smaller, it's always a good idea to have a hand lens. And in fact, if you really want to see what's going on, you almost certainly need to use a hand lens. And I mentioned then that even though the different species in the family all have the same basic floral structure, that basic blueprint is tailored differently in different groups of species. And I said that we would, during the course of the year, look at some of these different variations on the structure of the flower. So this is bird's foot trefoil, our first example. And here the flowers are big enough to see that the structure is basically very similar to the structure of the furze flower. It's assigned to the genus Lotus. Lotus is its botanical name. We have 2 species of lotus here in Ireland out of around 100 species worldwide. The overall structure is very similar to furze. Strongly zygomorphic or bilaterally symmetrical flowers with the standard or flag petal here at the top, and notice the startlingly prominent bright red nectar arrows converging on the throat where the nectar is stored. Here are the 2 wing petals as a landing platform for bees, covering the 2 keel petals at the bottom. But where in furze, if you remember, the 2 keel petals are only lightly joined on top, here they are properly fused together, except for a small opening at the very tip. Here again the stamens shed their pollen inside the closed keel before the flower opens, and the anthers then shrivel up. But in this case, the 5 filaments elongate and their ends become club-like, walling off the pollen in the front part of the keel. As in the case of furze, a fold at the base of each of the wing petals locks neatly into a socket on either side of the keel, keeping the flower locked until the pressure of an arriving bee disengages the fold from its socket, transferring the bee's weight onto the keel. In furze, the weight of the bee causes the keel to split along the seam between the 2 petals, allowing the stamens of the style to spring upwards, dusting the bee's abdomen with pollen. But here in bird's foot trefoil, this can't happen because the keel is sealed along that upper seam. The 2 petals are fused, and the only opening is at the tip of the keel. What happens instead is that the pressure of the landing bee causes the clubbed tips of the filaments to push the pollen packed in the chamber at the front of the keel out through that small opening at the tip, smearing it neatly onto the underside of the bee's abdomen, rather like toothpaste being squeezed from the tube. The pollen is closely followed by the stigma and tip of the style. You might think self-pollination would have taken place inside the keel when the stigma was surrounded by pollen, but the stigma only becomes receptive after abrasion, promoting cross-pollination. When the bee flies off, the locking mechanism of the petals re-engages and is ready to repeat the process for the next visitor, and the next after that, for as many as 5 or 6 times. Upwards of 50 species of bees have been recorded on the flowers of bird's foot trefoil. Butterflies and moths will sometimes visit, but they are ineffective as pollinators. Only bees can pollinate the flowers of bird's foot trefoil. But if it's a sunny day in summer, early in summer, you'll often see numbers of small butterflies flitting about among the flowers. These are dingy skippers, whose food plant is bird's foot trefoil. The caterpillars make a little shelter by binding a few leaves together with silk. They will hibernate in this as caterpillars before pupating next spring. The dingy part of the name refers to the rather drab moth-like pattern on the wings, and the skipper bit refers to the rapid short bursts of flight, skipping quickly from one spot to another. Another insect you often see here is the burnet companion, whose caterpillar also feeds on bird's foot trefoil and is unusual in being a day-flying moth. As for an explanation of how the plant came by its name of bird's foot trefoil, we need to take a look at the seed pods. Here they are, and as you can see, I don't need to explain any further. The toes even have toenails.